Hello, time for another Man in Gray book review. Today's book is The Korean War by Andrew Mulholland, published by William Collins in 2013. It's 116 pages. As you can see here, this is part of a book series called History in an Hour. These are short, popular history books on various topics that you're supposed to be able to read in an hour, although at 116 pages, most people will probably take more than an hour to read this book. The Korean War lasted from 1950 to 1953. It's often called the Forgotten War. It was bookended between two larger and longer wars, World War II and the Vietnam War. Both of those wars ended with a clear set of winners and a clear set of losers, whereas the Korean War ended in a stalemate, which many people then and now regard as unsatisfactory. But as Andrew Mulholland points out in this book, though, the Korean War was very significant because it established for the first time the American doctrine of containment of communism. The United States and its allies were not willing to fight an all-out war to defeat communism because that would almost certainly have involved nuclear weapons and a possible nuclear holocaust ending life as we know it. They weren't willing to do that. But what they were willing to do was to fight limited regional wars using conventional weapons, not to defeat communism, but to prevent it from spreading into other countries. Now, there were two major miscalculations in the Korean War. One was on the part of the Korean dictator Kim Il-sung. The other one was on the part of the American president Harry Truman. What Kim's mistake made was he assumed that he could invade South Korea and the United States wouldn't do anything about it. He assumed that after fighting a long, bloody war with Japan and being bogged down in Europe, fighting an unfought Cold War with the Soviet Union, that the Americans would have no stomach to defend South Korea, particularly since South Korea wasn't even a democracy. But what Kim Il-sung did not really appreciate was the political situation that Truman faced. In 1948, the communists under Mao Zedong seized control of China. And the Truman administration faced enormous criticism, not just from Republicans, but from Democrats as well, for letting the communists take over China. So there was no way that Harry Truman was going to stand by and let another Asian country fall to a communist force. And so he immediately stepped in and he rallied the UN countries that were American allies to join a war against the North Koreans. The other miscalculation on the part of Harry Truman came later in the war. What happened at first in the early days of the war, the poorly equipped and poorly trained South Korean army was completely overwhelmed by the North. It took a while for the Americans to get there. They didn't have enough troops, and they were being pushed down the peninsula to where they were almost at the very edge of the continent, almost at the very edge of the peninsula. So it looked like the North Koreans were going to win the war. But in doing so, in making this rapid movement downward, the North Korean army greatly stressed their supply lines. They stretched them way too far. And General Douglas MacArthur conceived of a brilliant but daring plan to land an amphibious force farther up the coast at the port of Incheon. And he was successful in doing this. And after the Incheon landings, the North Korean army found their supply lines cut. And so they had to rapidly retreat back to the north. And this is when Mao Zedong, of the Chinese dictator, stepped in. He basically warned the Americans and the UN forces that if they continued to push northward up into North Korean territory, that he would send Chinese troops in to intercede. And Truman didn't really take this threat seriously. He didn't think that the Chinese were willing to risk a war with the United States over North Korea, but Mao wasn't about to allow North Korea to fall to the Americans and have American forces right on his border. And so he did eventually intervene, and that changed the whole nature of the war. At the first part, of course, the North Koreans were winning. Then the Americans and the South Koreans were winning. And when the Chinese got involved, the war ground to a bloody stalemate, where it became pretty clear that after the forces kind of stabilized that neither side was going to be able to win the war. There were really violent, bloody battles fought over small areas of land, somewhat similar to World War I, where there was huge fights over a very small amount of acreage. And it became clear that neither side was going to be able to win the war. And so the obvious solution was to agree to a ceasefire where both sides retreated to the positions pretty much where they were at the beginning of the war. And even though this seems obvious, it took months of negotiations for the ceasefire to finally go into effect, largely because of the Russian dictator Joseph Stalin, who wanted the war to continue as long as possible because he wanted to tie down American troops in Korea so they wouldn't be in Europe, facing him in Europe. But when Stalin died suddenly in 1953, the new rulers of the Soviet Union and Mao, who got tired of all the lives that were being lost, the money he was having to spend to keep the war going on, they both agreed to pressure North Korea into accepting a ceasefire. And that's what happened. The war ended in 1953 with both sides standing about where they were at the beginning of the war. And again, as I said, this was not very popular with a lot of people, but you can look in the long term and see, as the Mulholland does in the last chapter here, the long-term effects of the Korean War were to establish that the United States was willing to stand up to communist aggression and that they preserved South Korea from communist takeover. Now, of course, South Korea is a democracy, and it's one of the most prosperous countries in Asia, whereas North Korea remains in the iron grip of the Kim family, and that country remains one of the few Marxist countries left in the world. It's still there long after the Soviet Union collapsed and after the Chinese communists gave up communism and embraced capitalism. The Kim family is still there and still controlling things. And so that would have been the fate of the South Koreans had the Americans and the UN forces not intervened in the Korean War. So I think a lot of people who kind of say the Korean War was useless or a pointless waste of lives don't really appreciate the fact that without it, South Korea would be a very different land than it is today. The book also points out some of the technological changes that occurred during the Korean War. This was the first war in which jet fighters from both sides fought each other. And it was the first war in which helicopters made a major contribution to the war, particularly in evacuating wounded people from the battlefield. So if you are interested at all in this neglected but very important war in American history, this is a good place to start. It's a short book, but it's very comprehensive and covers all the major battles and the basic causes of the war and the after effects of the war. The book is The Korean War, History in an Hour, written by Andrew Mulholland. This has been another Man in Gray book review. Thanks for watching.